We do appreciate you being here this evening, and want to encourage everyone to be here Wednesday nights and all of the times that we're gathering together to worship and study God's Word. It is needful for us, but it's also an encouragement for us and encouragement for other individuals as well. This evening, I want to look at the subject of no substitutes, or begin looking at it, and we'll continue at least the next couple of Sunday evenings. And as a basis for our study, if you'll turn to the first chapter of Romans, we are going to see that in this chapter, Paul sets forth for our consideration several principles that are necessary to the success of mankind. If you look at the latter part of the chapter, the first chapter of Romans, you'll see the destruction of society. In reality, if you continue in the ways in which he sets forth there in the latter part of Romans 1, it's going to be the destruction of mankind. And so there are, though, those principles that he's setting forth within this chapter in which there are really no substitutes. And there can be no substitutes for those principles. And when these principles disappear from a people, then they're going to suffer the wrath of God. It doesn't matter who they are, where they are, the time frame that they live in. As a people, whether you're talking about a nation, for example, we should realize that righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. And thus, when those principles of rightness go away from people and you start substituting other things for those principles of rightness, then that sin is going to be a reproach to them, and they're going to be eventually destroyed. In Romans 1 and verse 18, he sets forth here for us that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. And that's what we're talking about in regards to this, that God's wrath is going to come upon those individuals when you start leaving those principles of rightness, those principles that God has set forth within His Word. We see that in our own nation today. If you look at our society is leaving the principles of God and going off into wickedness. And what are we observing? We're observing the continual degradation of our nation. When we held up those principles of rightness, those principles that are found within God's Word, then we grew as a nation. We became a great nation with those principles. But if you go through the period of the Judges, you'll see a continual cycle where when the people became prosperous because of God's blessings. Now, why did they have God's blessings? Because the people turned to God and did what God wanted them to do. But they became prosperous, and when they became prosperous, they thought that they had no need of God. And when they then thinking they had no need of God, they would then follow off into wickedness and sin, and destruction would soon come their way, which would then, of course, bring them back or call them back to God, and then the cycle would begin over again. But you see that principle, and we see it in our society now. experienced that prosperity when we were faithful to God and the principles that God sets forth. Not saying, of course, that America is a Christian nation, because it's not. It never has been. But it followed the principles of Christianity, the principles of right. And it's getting away from that and has denigrated those principles now. And now then, we are seeing the destruction of our nation, the degradation of our nation. And so I want us to begin studying this evening some things for which there can be no substitute. And the first thing we want to look at is that there can be no substitute for God. In this first chapter of Romans, if we look at verses 18 through 20 and then 23 through 25, Paul sets forth the principles of God when he begins, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath showed it unto them. For the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." Here in the 20th verse, and we'll continue on in verses 23 through 25 in just a minute, that here's the invisible things of Him, of God, are clearly seen, or perceived, is, I believe, the way that the American Standard has it. That they are perceived by man. How? Well, by various ways, but one by nature, and what he's dealing with here. They are clearly perceived or seen because of the creation of the world. And so we look at the creation and we know God exists. And we can understand that there is a higher power, and we'll get into this more in our study tonight. We can understand His eternal power and the fact that there is a God, His Godhead. And Paul is saying, even though these Gentiles did not have the revelation of God revealed to them as the Israelites had, they were still without excuse. Notice that last phrase there in verse 20, so that they are without excuse. Why were they without excuse? Because they could perceive the fact that God is, and perceiving the fact that God is, they should seek after God. They had an obligation to seek after Him because of the creation. And thus, when they failed to seek after God, they were without excuse, because God had revealed Himself through the creation of the world. Well, notice in going on into verse 23 then, through 25, that they changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds, and four-footed beasts, and creeping things. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Here's these individuals, the Gentile world, and he says, God revealed Himself through the creation of the world so that they should have sought after Him and sought His way, but they didn't. And thus the wrath of God comes upon them. They are without excuse. What did they do? They substituted things for God. Here's the glory of the incorruptible God, or the uncorruptible God, and they changed it to things like to corruptible man, and birds, and four-footed beasts, creeping things, the things of this world. And they worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. They should have been worshiping and serving the Creator, because the creation would lead them to the Creator. But they worshiped the creation instead of the Creator, and thus they were without excuse, and the wrath of God would thus come upon them. And thus we start seeing that nature itself proves the existence of God. I know God exists. How? By nature. That proves to me and to everyone who thinks about it logically and correctly that God is. In Psalm 19 and verse 1, the psalmist says, "That the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth His handiwork." You look at the heavens and you say, God is. You see the glory of God. You see that this world and all of the things of this world are simply the handiwork of God. And it should lead us to, of course, worship Him. In our discussion this evening and looking at this aspect of nature proving the existence of God, I know that I'm going to deal with some technical arguments. And I'll try to explain these where we can all understand them. They will be clear, but I realize that these are arguments that, in reality, the atheist, try as they may, have never been able to answer because they are unanswerable. The first is called the cosmological argument. Basically, this says that for every effect, there must be a sufficient cause. Now, we understand that. We have a sound system in this building. It works fairly well right now. How many of us believe that this sound system just all of a sudden came into being? That the speakers, that they didn't exist and all of a sudden they appeared there? That the microphones that we have, they didn't exist, but all of a sudden they just appeared. Now then, if I tried to convince you that that was the case, that those speakers, they didn't exist, and all of a sudden they just appeared out of nothingness, and that these microphones and the receiver for the microphones and the amplifier and all of the other things that are back there in that sound area, that all of a sudden they just appeared out of nothingness, you would think I was Looney Tunes. You'd be ready to call the people in the white coats with the big net to come and grab me and take me and haul me off to the funny farm. Now why? Because it is ridiculous to think such. I know, and that's what we're dealing with, for every effect, here we have a sound system. It is an effect. There had to be something that caused the effect. There had to be something that caused the speakers. There had to be something that caused the microphones and the receiver and all of the other things dealing with the sound system that we have. I mean, that's simple to understand. There had to be an adequate cause for those things. Now then, if I tried to explain to you that here's those speakers. We have 8 of them in this auditorium. And I just got all of the parts together. And they were all, had all of these parts of all of these 8 speakers. And I got them all of them on a table. and I was somehow able to throw them up into the air, and they came down and they were assembled, and they now are in the place where they are. Again, you would think I was crazy. Why? Because that's not an adequate cause. And for me to try to argue that that caused these speakers to assemble themselves and be placed in the positions that they are now, you know that that's not the case. It's not an adequate cause for the effect of these speakers and those speakers placed in those positions. For every effect, there must be an adequate cause. Now, putting that in an argument form, a technical argument, it would say that if a contingent being exists, then the absolute necessary being exists. The necessary being, in this case, being God. I am a contingent being, thus I exist. Therefore, God, the necessary being, exists. Now, what do we mean by contingent being? Contingent being, very simply, is a being that is dependent for existence. That it has to be caused by something. It did not cause itself. It did not just simply come into existence. It had to be caused by something. If there is any contingent being, and what we're talking about in relationship to the speakers, those would be contingent beings in that sense. They exist. There had to be a necessary being to make those speakers. There had to be necessary beings that place those speakers where they are. And thus, those individuals who made the speakers, and they were made by some individuals that worked for the company of AudioVox, I believe, who made those speakers. Those speakers, though, are contingent beings. The necessary beings to make those were the men who worked for AudioVox. That's all that this is saying, but this is a technical aspect, and putting it in a technical, formal argument that here I exist. I am dependent upon something for my existence. When we go back to God, and sometimes someone will ask us, well, what caused God then? God is not a contingent being, though. And so, with God, we generally refer to it as that He is an uncaused first cause. Now, to get that, He is uncaused. That is, He has always existed. There is nothing, He is not that contingent being. He is, because He is eternal, and thus He's always existed. He is the first cause, and so He's an uncaused, but He is also the first cause in that He is that one who brought everything else into existence. He caused everything that we see to come into existence. God spoke, and this world came into being. That very basically is what we refer to as the cosmological argument. For every contingent being, like you, me, this universe that we see, this world that we live on, the air, the oxygen that we breathe, all of the things of this world, if that contingent being exists, then there's an absolute necessary being that exists. There had to be something that caused all of these things. Now then, some, in order to escape this argument, have said, well, we don't really exist. That we're all just simply figments of imagination. And when one person said that, I wanted to go over and just pinch a plug out of his arm and say, did you feel that? If you felt that, then it's not your imagination. You exist. But that's going to the absurd in order to escape the argument. The argument cannot be defeated. We exist, therefore there had to be something that was adequate that caused our existence. But then there's the teleological argument. These two arguments work hand in hand together in reality. The teleological argument goes that the marvelous design of whatever you want to consider that is involved in these matters can only be explained in light of a designer, that designer being God. I believe it was William Paley who first used the argument of a watch. That if somebody was walking down a deserted beach and they found a watch, they could look at this, and in this case, my watch, it has 3 hands on it. It has 3 numbers actually, but then there's also another place where there is the day that changes, and those things go around. And if I should look at the back, I see a thing that goes around in order to keep it wound so that I don't have to sit there and wind it all the time. And if I should open that and go into it deeper, there would be gears and there would be all of these other things. And I would know that just by reason that that watch had to be designed, because there is intricate design that is involved in the watch. Thus, there had to be someone who designed the watch. Now, I say William Paley, I believe, is the first one who used that argument, even though this argument of the teleological argument has been around much longer than that. But if we look at the human body, and you can look at just about any system that you want to. I put on here the hand. Try and get someone to design a hand today. Oh wait, I used the wrong word though. Did you notice that? Get someone to do what? Design a hand. We've been trying to for years, and the intricacies of the human hand, it's just hard to duplicate, even with all of the scientific advances that we've made through these years. And we still have people trying to design a hand to be a substitute for someone who loses their hand. But there's got to be someone designing it. Why? Because the hand shows design. It evidences design. Look at the eye. Now, we have a camera back there at the back. That is, I've got to admit, it's an amazing camera. It's small. It has a 40 power optical zoom where it can zoom in close to things. It has an automatic zoom. The brightness of it goes up and down. But in all of that, guess what? It doesn't come close in design to the human eye. The human eye is still more advanced than that which we have been able to design as far as cameras are concerned. Oh, but wait, there's design again in those cameras. Someone, we know when we see that, and the marvelous work of that camera, we know someone was there designing it. Yet, that which is more complex, someone's going to tell us that it just happened by chance, that there's no design that's involved in it. No, of course there's design that's involved in the human eye and the seeing process by which we go through. You could look at the respiratory system, the reproductive system, the muscular system, the bones within the human body. And you could just continue on. All of these evidence design. And far too many for us to even mention tonight. In fact, far more than I even know. And you could look at each one of those, and every one of them evidences design. This world itself evidences design. Our universe evidences design. We all probably know that just recently we sent an unmanned spaceship to Mars, and it landed on Mars. How in the world could they get that to land on Mars? Why didn't they shoot that up in the air and it just keep going and miss everything? How in the world could they determine that we need to shoot it right here at this point in time so that when it reaches that place, Mars will be in that specific location? You want to know how they did that? Because of the design that is found within our solar system. That there is design that is there so that Mars would be at a specific location at a specific time, and I can shoot a spaceship from this world and it would travel at a certain speed, and when it gets to that distance, Mars will be there. That's design within the universe. You cannot argue against design. Now, when we put this in a formal logical argument, it is an argument from form that is a deduction from order and adjustment. That's design, is all that's saying. And to design, that there is order, that there is adjustment that is there. And that's what order is. What I was saying, Mars would be at a specific location at a specific time. That's order. And our universe sets forth order. Why do we know that there's 365 days in a year? And if you want to be a little bit more technical, you can get it down to basically 365 and a quarter. And if you want to be even more specific, it can go off into several decimals after that. How do we know that? Because there's order there. That order sets forth design. So, a deduction from order and adjustment to design. And then from design, there must be a designer. If there's design that is involved, there has to be someone who designed it. That designer is God. And since it is, and that's what we've been setting forth in this lesson, that order and adjustment do exist, therefore it's clear that God exists. Years ago, I believe it was in the mid-1970s, Anthony Flew debated Thomas B. Warren. And Anthony Flew took the position that God did not exist. He was an atheist. Continued to be an atheist for many years. But just a couple of years ago, he came out and said that he had to accept the evidence that God exists. Now, he did not take a position that he basically took a deistic position that God created the world and all of the things in the world, but then he left the world all to itself and has never involved himself in the affairs of man. And so while he's wrong about that, it was interesting. He said the evidence demanded that there be a designer. And because of this argument, the teleological argument, he became a believer in God. Not the God of the Bible, as revealed within the Bible, but he knew God exists. A designer was there who is God, and because the evidence demanded it. But then a third is a sense of oughtness. This is referred to as the moral argument. A sense of oughtness in man testifies that there is a God. And when we talk about this, we need to realize that there does exist such a thing as outside, objective, moral law. A law that is beyond or greater than international law. In the debate that Warren had with Flew, this is one of the major arguments that Tom Warren used in relationship to proving the existence of God. And he continued to press Anthony Flew regarding Hitler. Did Hitler do anything that is wrong? Well, of course, Anthony Flew was not willing to say he didn't do anything wrong. Of course, no one else is either. No one is going to argue that Hitler and the murder of those 6 million Jews did right. Everyone agrees he did wrong. Based upon what, though? He did not violate Germany's law. That was their law. During the Nuremberg trials that took place after World War II, the individuals that were held to or were tried in that trial argued we did not violate any law. That was our law, to do those things. And it was their law. They didn't violate German law. The reason they were convicted is because there was a recognition of a greater law than man's law. They rejected international law. Just said, why should it apply to us? They were guilty because they violated a greater law. That law being a law of God. That those things were morally wrong. And thus, Hitler and the murder of those 6 million Jews did wrong. But if an individual says they did wrong, that means that there has to be a standard by which you can judge that they did wrong. That standard cannot be German law. It cannot be international law. What is it then? It is a sense of oughtness that should not have been done because it was itself wrong. An individual, generally criminal, let's say, today, doesn't think too much about going out and stealing from you, let's say. They break into your house, they steal all of your goods. But they know they don't want it done to them. Why? What's wrong with it? Well, that's wrong. If you break into my house and steal my goods, even though I'll do it to you, it's wrong if you do it to me. Why is there that sense of oughtness? That there are certain things that ought to be done and those things that ought not to be done. They have a sense of oughtness. Even though they will ignore the laws of the land, there's still that sense of oughtness within them. That's a moral law that is above, that is greater than man's law. That it is objectively wrong for Hitler or anyone else to murder those 6 million Jews. It would be wrong. It was wrong back in the 1940s. It will be wrong in the year 2010 or 2012. It will be wrong if the world continues in 2140. Why? Because it is always wrong. It is objective moral law. And thus, this is a deduction from the objectivity of right and wrong to an ultimate good, that ultimate good being God. If there is, and really the atheist cannot say anything is good, he cannot say that anything is evil. If good or evil exist, then he has admitted that there is an ultimate good that transcends what man says. That ultimate good that determines right or wrong is God. And thus, God exists. That's a sense of oughtness within man, a moral law. God exists. Nature declares the glory of God. But as we come to Romans, the first chapter, what we see is that man has substituted other things for God. Paul speaks of those who had substituted idols, whether it be man, birds, four-footed beast, whatever it might be. Here's idols that they had created with their own hands that they worshiped as God. They substituted those idols for God. But the result of that substitution is that they became morally bankrupt, morally evil. And that's what we see in the rest of that first chapter of Romans. That's what's becoming, what's happening to our society today in America. We're driving out God and we're replacing God with other things. We're substituting other things for God. We're substituting work, we're substituting job, we're success or pleasure. We're a hedonistic society that seeks pleasure above everything else. In fact, when Thomas Warren debated Barnhart, it was a debate dealing with what is right, what is a moral or an ethical standard that is greater. And basically, Barnhart said, well, that ethical standard is man, and what brings man the greatest pleasure. Well, the thing is, that is an inconsistent standard. The only true standard is God, and that goes back to that moral argument again. But here's society that says, live for yourself. We have simply substituted self for God. And we place God, taking God off of that throne, and we place self upon it. And whatever pleases self, whatever pleases me, that's what I ought to do. That's what the way in which Barnhart debated. The problem is, what if something brings pleasure to me, but it brings evil to Brother Brantley over here? Now, whose standard are we to go by? And so they have a difficulty with that. And so what do? They say, well, what brings pleasure to the greatest number of people? Who's going to determine that? Number one. And number two, why should I, if bringing pleasure to me is really the greatest thing, why should I care about pleasure as to other individuals? Why should I care about Paul Brantley's pleasure, or Tim Kozad's, or anyone else's? And what would be good for them? Who cares about them? The only thing that's important is me. And so it becomes an inconsistent standard. But what they did in doing that is they say, we're not going to accept God. And so we're substituting pleasure for God. Pleasure becomes the greatest good. Others, Ayn Rand, for example, argued that selfishness was the way to go. That everyone ought to be selfish. Well, that again, who cares about you? As long as it pleases me, that's all that's important. See, there is no standard once you take away God. And yet we continue to do that. We continue to substitute other things for God, instead of allowing God to have the preeminence within our life. And as we talked about this morning, to allow God to have priority within our life. And only as we allow God to have priority in our life will we live successful lives. They substituted worshiping the creature for the Creator. And as a result, they became morally bankrupt, and the wrath of God came, or is revealed again from heaven against all ungodliness and worldly and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. The wrath of God was revealed against those nations because they substituted for God, instead of following the evidence which would lead them to God. And in following that evidence that would lead them to God, they would follow that which God sets forth. They would follow His way and His will. We have that will revealed to us today within the pages of the New Testament. And if we want to live successful lives, if we want to avoid the wrath of God coming upon us, we're going to have to worship God and place Him in that proper preeminence within our life. Now, if you've not done that, and why not this evening obey the gospel of Jesus Christ? Place God within that proper place within your life. Or if you have and you haven't yet continued to live in that way that God would have you to live, then why not come back into Him this morning or this evening? Repent of your sins and come back and place God at that preeminent position within your life. Worship God as truly the Creator and the sustainer of our lives. If you need to come, and why not do so as we stand and sing the invitation song?